Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. My name is Nicola Brandt. I am a child protection specialist with UNICEF Eastern and Southern Africa Regional Office. And on behalf of the Regional Learning Platform on Care Reform, I'm really pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, which, as you know, is focused on care for children with albinism and disability-inclusive care reform. You may have already noticed the webinar is being recorded. We've seen in the past that the recordings really are a great resource for those of us who are unable to join on the date of the webinar. So this will be, of course, shared throughout the learning platform. And for technical reasons, we ask to please mute yourself and as many of you have already done, to please introduce yourselves in the chat box. If you could please mention your name, the country where you work, and who you work for, that would be greatly appreciated. We have today a captioning option, so if you hover at the bottom right of your screen over the word more, you can click on options and you will be granted the captioning option, which is really important. We also today have French interpretation. The Portuguese interpretation wasn't requested, so we have the French. And for that, you see the instructions on the slide, so please hover over the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen, choose your language, and then, very importantly, mute the original audio. Please do this even if you want to listen to or speak in English so that the interpreters can hear what you have to say. Just a few words on the regional learning platform on care reform, of which this webinar forms part. The platform was set up by UNICEF Asaro with contributions from Changing the Way We Care. We've are now completing the 4th phase of the learning platform. The 5th phase begins next year. And really, it's meant as an opportunity for policymakers and practitioners from across the Eastern and Southern Africa region and beyond to exchange learning on care reform. We have webinars such as the one today. We produce policy papers, videos, and case studies. And very importantly, we also have a help desk, which allows anyone in the region from government or UNICEF to request support on care reform. We also have a newsletter, which usually contains a short 5-minute article providing new insights on aspects of care reform. So we really encourage you to sign up to the newsletter if you haven't yet. And a new feature that we started this year is that we've also been convening interactive workshops on different aspects of care reform. So for example, in June, we convened the first interactive workshop on care leavers networks, and then in September on collecting data on children in residential care, and we look forward to doing more of these next year. So today, we are really very much looking forward to discussing with you care for children with albinism and disability-inclusive care reform. We know that children with albinism in the Eastern and Southern African region really face the significant risk of family separation, and that this is caused by stigmatization as well as societal discrimination. It's caused by lack of access to inclusive education and health services, and very deeply concerning, the risk of being ritually attacked and mutilated. So as a result, some children with albinism are being placed in harmful forms of institutional care for their own protection and or to access essential services. And children with albinism are really a highly vulnerable group of children whose rights and needs really deserve special attention in national efforts to reform care systems. Efforts to prevent family separation and support family-based alternative care for this highly vulnerable group of children have led to many lessons learned on care reform in Africa, and this includes insights into inclusive and integrated models, the use of small group homes, and the linkages between care and boarding schools. So in today's webinar, we are aiming to do 2 things. One is, first of all, to increase awareness of the challenges facing children with albinism and their families in securing their right to family life in Eastern and Southern Africa. And secondly, to increase understanding of good practices to prevent children with albinism from being separated from their families and to provide them with family and community-based alternative care when separation is unavoidable. And above all, of course, the best interests of the child, as per the Convention on the Rights of the Child, must be a primary consideration in all efforts. So in today's webinar, we're going to have two sessions. The first session will be led by Moluka and Mitty Drummond, the United Nations independent expert on the enjoyment of human rights by persons with albinism. And then in the second session, we will have a panel discussion with albinism rights and child rights experts. And we're really pleased that UNICEF Isaro's regional children with disabilities specialist, Yeti Mola, will be moderating this panel discussion. And then finally, we will have a Q&A discussion, which will be facilitated by Martin Punax, who's a senior consultant at Child Frontiers and who also worked with Madame Moluka to support her in developing her recent independent experts report to the UN General Assembly on children with albinism and the right to a family life. And in this regard, given that we have that final Q&A session, we really very strongly encourage everyone online today to please enter any questions or comments you might have and place them directly into the chat box so that we can come to these when we are then in the Q&A session. So I hope this all sounds good to everyone. We're very much looking forward to today's discussion. And without further ado, we're going to start with the first part of the webinar. I'm really pleased that Moluka and Mitty Drummond is with us today. As mentioned, she's the United Nations independent expert on the enjoyment of rights by persons with albinism. Moluka has over 20 years of experience in human rights. She has held key roles at the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, the Southern Africa Litigation Center, as well as Amnesty International. She is also a visiting fellow at Staffordshire University, and Moluka holds degrees from the University of Venda, University of Pretoria, and the Open University in the UK. So we're really very excited to have Moluka with us today, and I turn it over to you, Moluka. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you everyone for attending and being here to listen to this webinar on right to family life for children with albinism, something that's very important to me. And as Nicola mentioned, it's the subject of my most recent report to the UN General Assembly. I'll be sharing my screen. See if I can find it. Okay, I'm hoping everyone can see the screen, if I can make this easier.
Yes, we can see that it's in presentation mode at the moment.
Yes, I will put it on. Thank you. So yeah, hopefully the screen is very well. Thank you so much. So as I mentioned, we're talking about the right, children with albinism and the right to family life. But before I get into that, I just wanted to talk briefly about myself, my role, and albinism, and then we'll go into the discussion of the right to family life. So as mentioned, I'm the independent expert on the enjoyment of human rights by persons with albinism, and this is briefly summarized as independent expert on albinism. I replaced Ms. Ikeponswa Iro in 2021, and she was the very first UN independent expert on albinism. So as an independent expert, I'm appointed by the UN, but I am independent of the UN. So I'm not considered UN staff, but I'm recognized by the UN and given access to various UN platforms because of the expertise around this issue. My role is to promote, protect, and advance the rights of persons with albinism. And this is done through a number of ways, including reports, dialoguing with states, and carrying out country visits to different countries in the world globally to look into the situation of persons with albinism and provide expert technical advice and opinion. Now, what is albinism? I think it's always important for us to make sure we're on the same page. So albinism is a non-contagious, rare genetic condition, which results in the lack of melanin pigmentation. And we've got two types. There's OCA, and the longer name for this is oculocutaneous albinism. And oculocutaneous albinism is characterized by lack of melanin in the hair, skin, and eyes. So we have a picture there of Shuli Yabing, who is a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador on the fight against racism. She is a person with albinism herself. And so that's what we put there. She's Asian, she's Asian heritage, and that's a photo of her. So she looks quite blonde, which is not very common for persons from the region, and that's due to her albinism. The other form of albinism is ocular albinism, which only impacts the eyes. I will, during my talk, use the term persons with albinism. The term that used to be used is albino, and this is the term that we no longer use. It's considered derogatory, and persons with albinism is preferred because it puts emphasis on the person before the condition, recognizing that we're talking about people. So albinism is also seen as a disability, and I think it's important for us to mention that. And it's seen as a disability for two reasons. Firstly, due to visual impairment. So persons with albinism often have visual impairment, including low visual acuity, nystagmus, which is the rapid eye movement from side to side. Sometimes may have strabismus, which sometimes is referred to as cross eyes, and will also have photophobia, sensitivity to the sun, eye sensitivity to the sun. But also they're considered persons with disabilities due to the vulnerability to skin damage from the sun, including high vulnerability to skin cancer. And both of these are measures which states must put into place reasonable accommodations, including the use of assistive devices to support persons with albinism with regards to the barriers that they experience, so to remove the barriers. And that's why albinism is considered a disability. When it comes to, excuse me, persons with albinism, part of the reason why there was a need to set up an independent expert is because of various human rights violations that persons with albinism often face. So stigma and discrimination being the main discrimination, main human rights concern, but this is manifested in various ways. Mainly in the African continent, or only in some countries in the African continent, there have been attacks and killings of persons with albinism. And this is due to the belief that the body parts of persons with albinism, if used in ritual practices, can provide some kind of good luck or wealth. And because of this, persons with albinism are abducted, mutilated, killed in some countries on the continent. I've also mentioned the fact that albinism can fall within the definition of disability, which means that persons with albinism require reasonable accommodation and adaptations. But in many cases, there's a lack of reasonable accommodations in schools, workplaces, and other places. The other concern is regarding inadequate access to healthcare, and this is particularly concerning in relation to skin cancer and the susceptibility and vulnerability of persons with albinism to skin cancer. And the lack of sunscreen as well, which can also be seen as a form of assistive product for persons with albinism, which is lacking in many places. And then another concern would be the lack of inclusion. Now, all these concerns, I'm referring to persons with albinism, but children with albinism are often disproportionately impacted by all of these, including their. Unfortunately, there's a belief that, by some, wrong belief, I must say, that the potions made from ritual practices using the body parts of persons with albinism will be more potent if they're taken from children. And therefore, children are more disproportionately impacted by the attacks. The rights of persons with albinism are protected by almost all human rights conventions and treaties, but I wanted to emphasize the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the African Disability Protocol, and of course, like I mentioned, all the others as well, but I wanted to emphasize these two, bearing in mind the disability aspect. The African Disability Protocol actually specifically mentions persons with albinism, unlike the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. but the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability has specified that the CRPD applies to persons with albinism. There are also a few soft laws that are relevant, and I won't go through all of them, but they're on the screen. Now I want to look at the issue of children with albinism and the right to family life more specifically. The right to family life is, again, a right which not all of us are aware of or pay that much attention to, but it's actually contained in various UN treaties, conventions, the rights of the child being one of them, the rights of persons with disability. We also have the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child that also talk about, the right to family life. And then there's some soft kind of laws, standards that are also applicable that are worth looking at as well when we look at the right to family life. So why is the right to family life such a concern for persons with disabilities and for children with disabilities as well? Unfortunately, there are a number of drivers for family separation. We see a lot of circumstances where children with albinism are separated from their family, from their parents. And the drivers for this, first of all, is societal discrimination, the stigma, discrimination, the ostracization that children with albinism may experience, persons with albinism will experience in some cases. And as a result of this stigmatization, sometimes this stigmatization also impacts the broader family, the parents, other siblings of children with albinism as well. And this may lead to families abandoning their children, not wanting to be associated with the stigma. There are also some myths and beliefs that a child with albinism may be seen as bad luck or bad omen, may be seen as a curse, and therefore some parents may abandon their child with albinism because of the stigma. Another concern is the lack of accessibility to healthcare services. So particularly for those who live in rural areas or far from health facilities, children with albinism require regular eye care. They require regular visits to dermatologists, ophthalmologists for their eyes, access to sunscreen. And this may be very hard for some families to provide their children, especially if they live in rural areas. And we have seen cases where children are sent to relatives who live closer to towns where they have more access to these healthcare services, and are able to get regular healthcare services. I've mentioned the fear of attacks, and we've seen this in a number of countries where children with albinism are being attacked, and as a result, sometimes even the family are attacked. So, for example, in Madagascar, we have had a number of cases of children with albinism being attacked, and in Madagascar, for some reason, it has been eyes of children with albinism. For some reason, people are trying to get the eyes of children with albinism. And in the process of trying to abduct a child or, to take the eyes of a child, the fathers, the mothers, the parents who try and protect the child will also be hurt in the process. And so the fear of attack is not just fear that their child will be attacked, but there's fear that the broader family, the parents, the other children may also be impacted and be attacked as part of the attack against the child. Now, fear of this attack and the inability to protect children who are facing these attacks will often lead to parents abandoning children or sending children somewhere else for their protection. And this may be to relatives in safer parts of the country. It may also be to shelters or boarding schools. And I also have to mention that there's just the family is relinquishing the burden of care. So we have situations where children with albinism may be going to boarding schools, which will give them better access to education for some people because they do not have reasonable accommodations near the school, near home, or they do not have inclusive education in community schools near the home. And so what may happen after that is that the parents then realize that they would rather not have their children at home because they're relinquishing the burden of care. And so these are some of the drivers. So what have we seen to prevent or to keep children with albinism with their family? How do we prevent the separation of children and ensure that the children have the right to family life. And of course, I think most of you would be aware that family is the best unit for the child, for them to receive the care that they need. We have seen a number of initiatives in different places, but what the report says is the importance of awareness raising and behavior change. So we need to look at ways that will end the stigma and the discrimination, that will end the attacks, so that families can keep their children with them. Awareness raising is a big part of this as well for behavior change. And as part of that, the AU has adopted a plan of action on elimination of harmful practices against, on the elimination of attacks against persons with albinism, but this includes ensuring the right to education and healthcare and other rights. Social protection as well. What kind of protection can be provided to the family so that they can afford to take their children to the healthcare centers? We need to look at security. What kind of security can be provided, and access to justice to prevent these attacks, to ensure that those who are carrying out the attacks against the children are brought to justice. So there are a number of different, I won't go into everything, but there are a number of good practices that we have that the report identifies, and I'm sure will come up from the discussions. The other thing that we noticed in order to, that the report uncovers as a way of ensuring the right to family life for children with albinism are family-based alternative care options. Now, these are not ideal, but they sometimes need to be used. And first and foremost, I would like to promote kinship care if we have to get to the point, recognizing that there are cases where children are being attacked, where children are being killed, and the families are unable to protect them, especially if they live in areas of high incidences. Then we can recognize that sometimes those children may need to leave their families and go elsewhere to safer areas because the families may not be able to relocate together. And therefore, the child may be relocated to other families, other relatives in safer parts of the country. And so kinship care, which is a temporary method, which can be used while the systems are being put in place to make sure that the children can return to their family. Another option is foster care, which again ensures that a child is within a family environment rather than being in an institutional setting or something else. There are some traditional approaches as well that have happened, and these traditional approaches relate to families of persons with albinism being looked after by other families or supported by other families who have children with albinism. Adoption is also a form which might be used, but this would also say should not be the first option. And of course, it's not temporary; it's permanent, and it ends up being parental care anyway. So there have been some non-family-based alternative care, which we have seen examples of, for example, in Tanzania, where there were a number of killings and children with albinism were put in boarding schools for their own protection. And there have also been cases where children with albinism have been put in residential shelters, small-scale residential shelters for their protection. However, these are very concerning because they deprive children with albinism of their family, of the family environment. A study that was carried out by the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child showed how in Tanzania, a lot of these children ended up living in conditions that amounted to a violation of the right to health, didn't really receive the education they should have received. They lost their contact with families. They were not able to reunite with their families later. So actually this resulted in a violation of the rights. However, at the same time, when I was doing my report, I had to bear in mind that there is a clear and present danger sometimes. We've had that situation in Tanzania. We're seeing the situation in Madagascar where children are being killed, they're being targeted, they're being mutilated, and parents just cannot support their children, cannot protect their children from these attacks. And so there's a balance between the right to life and the right to family life in this case. And so we've also seen in Madagascar situations where parents have actually taken their children to police station, either for the whole day or at night, so that the children can be protected. And then that raises the question, like, okay, we want a child to grow up in a family, but if parents are going to take their child to a police station anyway, what does that say? So it was quite a very difficult decision to come to, and very researched, and I spoke to a number of organizations about this, bearing in mind all the concerns about this. And I think that the report finally concludes that there may be circumstances where it's impossible to protect the right to life of a child while at the same time protecting them from violence. I mean, while at the same time guaranteeing their right to family life. So it may be difficult to protect them from, to protect their right to life, protect them from violence, and at the same time guarantee their right to life. So in these cases, in exceptional cases such as this, there may be room for children with albinism to be placed in boarding schools and small-scale emergency shelters. I have to say again that these are exceptional circumstances. This has to be done on a case-by-case basis, and there must be an appropriate review by the authorities. It can't just be a full-scale, all children with albinism are going into boarding schools or shelters. It has to be, every case needs to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. And of course, Nicola mentioned this, the important need to take into consideration the best interest of the child. Is it better for that child to be in their family in the given circumstances and the context, or is it better for the child to be protected in these residential kind of temporary measures? And I have to say again, such measures must be temporary. And in order to make sure that they're temporary, there needs to be a plan in place on how, what will be done to ensure that these are temporary. What is the exit plan? When will a child be removed from the boarding school? And importantly, whatever the circumstances that are leading the child to be placed in a boarding school or in a shelter must be dealt with. So we have to make sure that there's access to justice, that there's protection from attacks, that there's, all these concerns that we've raised, the drivers are being tackled through some of these other measures we've mentioned before. Such boarding schools, temporary homes must be properly funded and supervised. We cannot have children in shelters that are not properly funded, where children are not getting the food and nutrition they need, are not getting the education, the reasonable accommodations they need because we lack funding. So if such measures are going to be put in place, we have to ensure that they are properly funded and supervised as well, so that children are being protected. Importantly, there has to be measures to ensure that there are regular visits from the family, and this will also facilitate family reintegration later and family reunification, and also visits where appropriate of the child to the community so that the child remains in the community. At the same time, we have to make sure that these institutions, because that's what they become in this case, offer individualized care so that we do not have an institutionalized framework. So there has to be individual care and protection of the child, and that there must be not just children with disabilities, but children without disabilities as well, so that we're not having a segregated area. And as I mentioned, the conditions leading to separation within the community must be addressed. So these are like some of the measures that we mentioned. For exceptional circumstances, I guess I have to repeat, exceptional circumstances where children with albinism may be put in institutional care. So the recommendations of the report, basically, just to summarize, was that there must be, first of all, long-term systemic change, at the societal level to address the root causes of separation. So this is what I mentioned first, access to justice, social protections, child reform, care systems as well. So there must be reform of the child protection and care systems on the ground. And then finally, where separation is unavoidable, there should be safe, temporary, family-based alternative care options. There should be safe, temporary, family-based alternative care options where you cannot avoid that. So first and foremost that. And then only in exceptional cases do we then look at boarding schools and emergency shelters. And those boarding schools and emergency shelters must have all necessary. So thank you so much. I'll end there. I'm happy to respond to any questions that anyone may have. I've also put up my social media handles in case anyone wants to reach out to me later. and I'll be happy to hand it back over to you and respond to any questions.
Thank you so much, Muluka. Really, we deeply appreciate it. And I think it was really helpful for all of us, first of all, to have a better understanding of the role of your crucial mandate, and then this overview of both the challenges and really rights violations that persons with disability, with albinism face in the region, and in particular the drivers of family separation and how critical really behavior change is in terms of trying to address the situation. And I thought it was also really helpful, the overview you provided in terms of family-based alternative care options and the impact of non-family-based alternative care, and really also acknowledging the balance that needs to be struck, particularly in situations of clear and present danger, where it's really about balancing the right to life and the right to family life. And well noted, the emphasis on boarding schools and small-scale emergency shelters really needing to be used in exceptional circumstances, with the emphasis on the temporary use and to have a solid exit plan. We'll, of course, share these slides and follow up. So colleagues online, you will get all the details, of course, and of course also the really critical recommendation towards the end in terms of really long-term systemic change and reform of child protection and care systems. We mentioned that we will have the Q&A towards the end of today's session, so we will go into the panel discussion, and we'd really very much encourage you to put any questions you might have to Muluka into the chat box, because Martin will certainly, during the Q&A, get to those questions and comments. So please do enter them as we proceed with the session. So first, thank you very much, Muluka, and we look forward to coming back to you during the Q&A. So with this, now that we've had this really great introduction, we're going to turn over to our panel discussion, and I'm really pleased to introduce Yeti Mola, the UNICEF Asaro Regional Specialist on the Rights of Children with Disabilities. So Yeti will be facilitating the discussion, after which we will then have our Q&A. So Yeti, I'm pleased to turn it over to you. Thank you. Yeti, we're having difficulties hearing you, although it does say that you're not muted, and we tested it before. Can you try again? Colleagues, do you have an idea? Because it worked so fine earlier when we tested it.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. You're unmuted now. Yes.
Thank you.
Over to you.
I know. I don't know what's this, but anyways, when Josephine said it says, okay. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Nicola, for the kind introduction. And can we all give a nice applause for Muluka? I want to see a virtual applause. That's a way for me to confirm you're with us. Yes? Yes, please give us a nice applause. Thank you so much. Thank you, and warm greetings from a very beautiful Nairobi, where it's quite sunny and beautiful, and where the birds are also joining us. So I'm so glad to join you with amazing panelists today from Tanzania, Perpetua from Tanzania, Nicholas from UNICEF Madagascar, and Peter from Uganda. And I would like to really thank my amazing panelists who have been really in this field of child protection, and mainly with a focus, also some of them with a focus on children with albinism. I don't want to do an unfair job of introducing them. So my first job will be giving them each 1 minute to say hello to all of you and tell you what they do, where they are joining you from, and whatever they will highlight just for them to introduce themselves. So I think we say ladies first, right? So Perpetua, can we start with you to introduce yourself just in 1 minute, please? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Yeti. Hope you can all hear me. My name is Perpetua Senkoro. I'm based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. I've been working in the albinism area for over 8 years now. Currently, I'm doing independent disability rights advocacy. Pleasure to meet all of you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now the plane is going to leave to Madagascar. Nicolas, you want to say hi and introduce yourself, please?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nicolas Sauvage. I'm child protection specialist at UNICEF Madagascar, and I work mainly on the strengthening the enabling environment for child protection in Madagascar. So the governance, the policy, coordination, legislation, and I've followed closely the work done by the government and NGOs and the UN system on albinism in the past 2 years with the rest of the team here at UNICEF. But it remains a joint effort to progress in this thematic. And also I must mention the growing effort with the research recruitment of disability inclusion specialists and assistants. Thank you for giving us the opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you, Nicolas. And back to East Africa, here, this side again. Uganda. Peter, you want to say hi and introduce yourself, please?
Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Ogit. I'm so delighted to be here. I'm co-founder of Source of the Nile Union of Persons with Albinism, an organization which was started in 2012. And we are still carrying on with advocating for the rights of people with albinism, but also we provide practical services in health, education, empowerment, and counseling and guidance for our persons with albinism. But as a person also, I work with the General Disability Fraternity. In our national organization, I serve as the board treasurer. In this capacity, we do a lot of advocacy in relation to persons with disability. I'm so delighted. I'm so happy to be in as a participant.
Thank you so much, Peter. I hope there was a bit of breaking of your voice at some point, and hope we will not continue to have that poor quality of sound. But yeah, you can just give them a big welcome to our panelists. I love virtual events as long as they're very lively. And by the way, this reminds me again to repeat what Nicola was telling you. We have an amazing chat platform where you can put your questions as our panelists are also speaking. That way we don't forget it. So any first arriving or early arriving questions in the chat box are going to be also covered at the beginning of our question and answer. So please use those chat platforms to really record your questions and contributions. Thank you so much. And those of you who are not speaking, I kindly ask you to mute yourself again. So I'm going to take you back from Nairobi to our neighbor, Tanzania. Perpetua, thank you so much for joining us as an independent disability rights advocate. That was my life and my title for quite so long. So I know it's not an easy work, but just tell us a little bit as we start the panel, because I think the experience of Tanzania is quite important, because Tanzania is one of the countries where we had one of the very first cases of children with albinism institutionalized being recorded. Okay, so I think this is quite an important step to kind of note, and maybe you can tell us most also about the temporary shelter holding by the government. That program, I think, yeah, would be something quite interesting to learn more about, really. And yeah, as I said, from Tanzania. Please, over to you. You have 5 minutes, Perpetua.
We can't hear you.
Are you on mute?
No, we don't hear you.
Can you hear
You're
me now?
mute. Yes, perfect, loud and clear. You're back.
Okay, thanks. So records show that attacks against people with albinism in Tanzania are dated back to 2006. And in response, to this, among other measures that were taken by the government and their families, was the establishment of temporary holding shelters, which were meant to be safe houses for children with albinism. And up to 32 of these were noted to exist. So as Muluka stated, there was a report by the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of Children, which was published in 2016. And this report came after they did an investigative mission on the situation of children with albinism in the temporary holding shelters. And what came out of this report, the report noted that children with albinism in the shelters, they were not free to live their daily lives in their areas of origin because of widespread practices of ritual attacks, and majority of the children had not visited their parents since 2008. Now, this report was published in 2016. Also, it noted that the living conditions in the shelters were dire. There was severe overcrowding and inadequate facilities. For example, the report noted that a compound in a shelter which was designed for 50 children housed up to 405 children. And this led to a shortage of beds and space. And also the food budgets were insufficient, which resulted in meals lacking proper nutrition. The report also noted a severe lack of teaching materials in the shelters, and this impacted the education of school-aged children with albinism. And as a result, some of the children were unable to attend classes, and some remained idle in the camps without access to further education opportunities. It also noted that there was an inadequate equipped health facility in the shelters, and it resulted to deteriorating health conditions of the children, which led to some of the children developing skin cancer at various stages, mainly due to the lack of sunscreen and proper health facilities. The report also noted that the centers had poor record keeping. For instance, there were poor record keeping in terms of birth registration documents upon arrival of the children at the shelters. Also, that some parents intentionally provided false information about the identities of their children to conceal their children's origin. And this eventually resulted into the loss or absence of information of some of the children, and complicated tracing efforts when it came to the taking back their children to their families. Additionally, some parents abandoned their children, ostensibly because they said they're protecting them from attacks. So this further exacerbated the issue of undocumented children with uncertain family linkages. There was also no clear strategy of exit. So when the shelters were instituted, there was no plan that this is temporary. So eventually we'll have to reinstate the original situation of children where they were living with their families. There were no guidelines, rules, or regulation for establishment of the shelters, including different shelters. So the report specifically mentioned Buangija at that time when it was still running. So overall, the shelters failed to meet the minimum standards for habitability for children. But thereafter, in 2019, the government adopted some guidelines. These were named the National Guidelines on Children's Reintegration with Families. So these guidelines lay down procedures facilitating return of children to their families. And in 2021, the government reported that all children with albinism in the shelters were returned to their homes. However, after this process, there were still some concerns which continue to linger. For instance, firstly, there was ongoing existence of attacks against children with albinism. For instance, this year, there was one attack where a 2-year-old Asimwe Novat was murdered and mutilated. This happened in Kagera region in May this year. Secondly, the whole deinstitutionalization of the shelters process was opaque in nature, and it still leaves questions about whether the reintegration plan involved a pre-assessment of the children's psychological preparedness for the change of environment, whether their families were ready to take them back and care for them and provide for their basic needs, and whether their safety and security situation of their home areas was indeed improved for them to go back home. Also, whether there was a follow-up plan and mechanisms in place to ensure that those children, are currently coping, cared for, and protected. On another note, on the side of NGOs, there are some NGOs which have also run care programs with regard to children with albinism, facilitating family visits in boarding school. So while this should not be accepted as a primary measure, it is essential to consider context at hand. For instance, at that time, looking at the security situation of people with albinism in Tanzania, as well as the living environment of the children who were in shelters, the most feasible option by then was inclusive boarding schools. And indeed, there were some positive results.
Thank you, Perpetua.
Yes.
I think we are going to put the rest in the chat.
Okay,
because we have to move on time and keep you. I'll try to give you 1 minute later on when we conclude the panel. Okay. Thank you for this excellent, amazing journey in such a short time. And colleagues, I forgot to mention that one of our panelists, unfortunately, has sent a late apology. Maybe you might have seen. Boniface from Malawi Human Rights Commission could not join us in person today, but we understand tomorrow is also the International Human Rights Day. I would like to go now to Madagascar and ask my colleague Nicholas. Nicholas, even though we know that for Tanzania, this thing has started a while ago, like around 2 decades, right? But Madagascar was not that big on the radar in terms of this kind of news for the attacks of children with albinism. Recently, we have learned that there is an increase, and we see from the media that there is an increase in the attack of children with albinism, actually. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what's happening now in Madagascar and what are UNICEF and other sister UN agencies and other stakeholders really doing, including government doing to really kind of stop this attack against these children with albinism, which is really quite threatening for a community who wants to thrive towards an inclusive future. Over to you, Niklas, and you have 5 minutes.
Indeed, Yetis, thank you very much. In Madagascar, people with albinism, mainly children, have been victims of attack and murders since February 2020 only, and it's increasing. There were 8 attacks in 2020 and more than 20 last semester. So last month, a child has been killed in the south and another gone missing. So before 2020, Madagascar was not considered a country of concerns from extreme violence against persons with albinism. And one of the challenges in understanding this phenomena is that there are no comprehensive data or statistics on people with albinism in Madagascar. And the phenomenon of life-threatening violence against persons is fairly recent. In Madagascar, people with albinism, they suffer from stigma and discrimination within their communities in both rural and urban areas. In the Malagasy language, they are called varira or bubu. They are often victims of social exclusions, bullying, and marginalization. Their visibility exacerbates stigmas and discrimination. There is a lack of inclusive knowledge and systems for persons with albinism that has led to exclusion. And here, the harmful practices relates to false beliefs and superstition is the main cause of violence, and they are aggravated by poverty, lack of education, and even natural disasters, in particular drought and cyclones, intensified by climate change. So in February 2022, the Committee on the Rights of the Child published its recommendation to improve the implementation of the convention, and they asked for strengthening the measures to eliminate discriminations against children with albinism. The independent experts, Ms. Mluka, sent an urgent appeal at that time in February 2022 with a press release, and she also came to visit the country in October 2022. She made a report in 2023 in January. And based on that, there was a joint committee, the government, the UN system, and the civil society that has been established under the leadership of the Ministry of Justice. So they made this committee permanent in order to follow, monitor the implementation of the recommendations of the report. However, today there has been no strategic recommendations that have been implemented. But the committee is working on the adoption of a national action plan. For the moment, the most practical support that has been provided is the support and empowerment of the Association Albinos Madagascar. That is an association that supports the people with albinism and involve them directly in the decisions that concern them. The association recorded 68 cases of attacks against this group of people, resulting in 18 deaths. And the situation is becoming a bit different because most of the cases of attack are taking place in the south of the country, and now it's going up north more recently. And so the local authority in this context identify children with albinism and try to place them in children's centers in the regions in order to protect them. So it's really based on the fear of the family and the population. And there has been 43 children that have been identified in the region to be moved from their family to centers, which is very worrying. And so the main challenge today in Madagascar is to make sure that we have alternative care measures, especially foster care, that is currently not available even legally in the country. And this is the main challenge. And so the priority is to make sure we make this foster care available as soon as possible in priority for children with albinism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicholas. And you've done it before your time. Thank you. Great. Thank you. And you have a question on the chat I was looking at from Somalia. Definitely, we will get some time later on to come back to questions. Thank you again for putting your questions in the chat. Now, I'm going to take you, colleagues, to Uganda. We have heard from Tanzania, where the first case of institutionalization has been recorded, as I said, when it comes into the care agenda for children with albinism. And now we're hearing more from Madagascar, unfortunately, a gray area where we are having more attacks happening and no data, really, no systematic data to track these children. I'm going to take you to Uganda, where situations may look a bit different and quite promising, Peter. I have been to Uganda on missions, different missions, and I have seen and I know that children with albinism do attend mainstream schools in their community. And I think there are lower risks of being attacked as a person with albinism, kind of looking like the safer, relatively safer place for children with albinism in this region to live in. And I know your organization, like the Source of Nile, SNUPA, and other stakeholders have been doing really great things. What are those great things that you can share with us that other countries can learn from? And what are the enabling environments to really kind of promote such a mainstreamed, community level life for our children, for our African children with albinism? Over to you, Peter.
Thank you so much.
Minutes, the same like the others.
Thank you so much. Let me hope this time I'm much clear.
Absolutely, much clearer now. We can hear you better.
All right, fantastic.
Thanks.
Yes, I want to take this great opportunity once again to speak to you. Just imagine you're a child and born in a community where you find yourself looking different, you're not even your parents. So here we see that it's beyond even the attacks, but even the psychological torture that we go through when we are so young. And making it even worse, it's hard even to explain to other people. When you come to like me, I used to ask my parents, why am I white and you black? Why am I looking differently from as a siblings. And it becomes even very worse when the parent did not have the right answer. This becomes
Peter, unfortunately, you're breaking. Peter, can you hear us? You're breaking.
Oh, sorry.
You're back now.
This becomes so challenging to the community, which is so primitive, to the extent of thinking that we carry magical powers. However, because of these challenges, that's why we try to find a way how better we can address some of these challenges. And it was one of the core reasons why we started Snooper, to be able to advocate for the rights of people with albinism, including the young ones. Because to grow, it was so extremely hard. We passed the law, and which we didn't want to see the young ones also go through the same situations. At school, we found that there is no right education because even the teachers never knew how better to support children at school. When you go to family design, by the way, 90% of children with albinism grow with single parents without even enough support. Right to help, parents never knew how better they can support even their children. But what has been done to solve some of these challenges? One, and this it's very possible and can be working, is first of all, creating awareness to let parents know that it's not about the parents, but it's about biologically how the child without being be. And once you're able to explain to this child, it will help him to or her to be very comfortable to understand, yes, I may look differently, but I'm the same like my father, I'm the same like my mother. And this will give that person that much empowerment. Those who think that we've seen that it has been supporting now the young children with albinism who are being born. Their parents are now able to explain to them how they are differently and how that doesn't make so much, not a big deal. Through that, we've seen now we've been able now to support the education of over at least I say 50% of children with albinism who use not to go to school. And I'm glad to say that now we have 20 graduates in different fields, including doctors, in medical, engineers, and different fields. We see now the community are joining us to combat those perpetrators. 2 weeks back, we got a report from the community who got the person who was trying to kidnap a child without. This now shows that now the society, not only the parents, not only the police, but everyone is concerned about the security of person without this, child without this. Another thing that I see that we we need to bring the government also to be in support of this. Thankful for our government that just get the national plan, which brings different things, including the many other rights to children without. I know much has not yet been put into implementation, but the gist of coming up with this national action plan gives hope and gives a lot of hope and energy and to part of it as knows, okay, we are not by our own, but we have those also who are trying to give it as support. Then in health-wise, we've tried so much to find different also different stakeholders, including the habits, on how and the importance of giving support to things like something locally, always encourage children to only the one to be and other things that will support them, not to protect them. I want to thank you so much. I know the time may not be enough to all the
excellent,
but that's
excellent.
what I would share with.
Thank you so much, Peter, also sharing with your own personal testimony. This is fantastic. I think all of them deserve a nice applause, colleagues. I can see we have 50 people in the room. And I know some people are joining in a group, so please, we need at least 50 applause from you guys. They need, yeah, amazing. Now it's the last time. I will have 1 minute for each one of you just to kind of conclude and tell us what is the one key thing that you think governments can do to really ensure that children with albinism have the right to live with their families safely. We have heard the parents' perspective. I have seen some questions, and more is going to be discussed. But before I hand over for the Q&A, Perpetua, you have 1 minute to tell us one key thing that you think should be done in order to ensure that children with albinism have the right to live in their families. I won't repeat the question. First Perpetua, then Nicholas, and then Peter, please. 1 minute each. Perpetua?
Thank you. So the one thing I see is the need to strengthen collaboration between government and CSOs to address attacks on children with albinism. And we should overcome the existing sensitivities and restriction that hinder sustainable action. Thank you.
Nicholas, we don't hear you in case you're speaking. You're on mute. Perfect.
Thank you. Well, in addition to the elaboration of a national action plan for the protection of rights of persons with albinism, we would consider that government should prioritize the strengthening of their child protection system, but also the recruitment of professional social workers to follow up complex cases, and to establish effective and responsive foster care systems to support family and to allow emergency placement of children at risk in foster family care.
Thank you so much. Strengthening workforce. Thank you, Nicholas. Over to you, Peter, for the last one key thing. We don't hear you, Peter, in case you're speaking.
Yeah,
no.
I would encourage government.
Perfect.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. We hear you. Yes, yes. Now we are back.
Yes, I continue to encourage government to work together with organizations and partners out there. But this one, they know better what they want, and they know what the help them.
Thank you, Peter. I will still encourage you to put this in the chat, as the sound quality was not that really great. Yeah, collaboration came out strongly, strengthening workforce, building strong and resilient child protection systems, ensuring that there are short-term and immediate, like long-term plans to really address cases, things like that. So now I think it's going to be the most exciting time where Martin will take us into the most participatory part of this webinar towards going through the question and answer. I would like to really thank my amazing panelists for your great contribution and quite amazing discipline in time management. Over to you, Martin, for the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Yeti, and a big thank you from me to Madam Maluka, and also each of the panelists. Each of you had so many very, very useful and enlightening points to make about this most difficult of subjects. Well, I'm really happy to say that we've had some really great questions in the chat, and not just questions. A lot of people have made comments about their own experiences of this issue in their own countries. So I'd just like to start by thanking each of you for sharing that. We can't cover all the questions, but we'll do the best we can to cover as many of them as we can. And just before I get going with the questions, I just want to say I'm very fortunate that I had the opportunity to work with Madam Maluka and a number of the panelists as part of the development for the report that Maluka talked about. So I know about the amazing work that they're all doing to address these issues on the ground, and I know how challenging it is, and yet despite those challenges, people are still finding ways to find solutions and find ways of preventing separation and address them when they happen. So just a big shout out from me to everyone who's spoken today for the great work that you're doing in proving that with hard work, children can stay with families. They don't need to be institutionalized. So moving on to the questions, I've separated these actually between different questions for different speakers and panelists. And I'm going to start actually with some questions for you, Nicholas, if that's okay. So I've got some questions around child protection system strengthening, about what are the gaps in child protection structures in communities that are allowing children to be separated from their families, and how can they be strengthened? And I want to link that question actually to some of the things that are one of our panelists who couldn't be here today, as Yeti said, we had a panelist from Malawi called Boniface Massa, who was going to be talking about the way that the needs of children with albinism can be better incorporated into child protection programs. One of the things he was going to talk about today was things like, for example, he does case management work. His organisation Standing Voice do case management, where they will work with families to make their houses more secure, have stronger doors, have stronger locks on the doors, which means that the houses are less likely to get attacked. So that's one way in which you can incorporate these specific needs of children with albinism into child protection case management. Another example that Boniface was going to talk about today was about how in Malawi the police have been trained to become more child protection sensitive, which is very effective from what we hear. And Boniface was going to say, now that we've reached that stage, we now need to make them more sensitive to the needs of children with albinism. So sorry, that's a very long question, Nicholas, but basically my question is, what can be done to integrate these issues more into existing child protection programs so child protection is more sensitive to the needs of children with albinism? Over to you.
Thank you, Martin, and it's very unfortunate that our panelists could not join us, because it's a very important topic. Well, I will only share some reflections, because our reflection in Madagascar is really the question of the balance between the rights to life and the right of the child to be cared for by his or her parents. And so it is the responsibility of the states to identify and implement solutions that are contributing to the realization of all the rights of children with albinism, and to mitigate these risks of implementing solutions that would not contribute to additional violations of their rights, because they are already facing multiple violations. So in Madagascar, as I said, the only solution offered today to parents are centers, institutionalization. And so to prevent the risk of institutionalization of children and the separation of from their family is to give priority to strengthening the child protection system and to adapt it to the needs of children with disability. But at the same time is to remember that they are children like any others, and that they should not receive a treatment that is different on the basis to others. We're promoting solutions that are inclusive, that would not put children in danger, all of them. And as a result, it's important to remember the United Nations guidelines for alternative care of children, and for the protection of children that are deprived of parental care in general. And so we face the same issue as for children victims of violence in their own family. They are institutionalized. We need to find solutions that would apply to all children, and especially to avoid for the family to be put apart definitely for long term. So the idea of having children taken care of by other members in an area that is not at risk, or with family members, or even foster family care, is a solution for a short term, and to continue to maintain as much as possible the link between the family and the children. So it requires a lot of social workforce. It requires a lot of attention to treat these children and this family as they need, corresponding to their very specific situation. Sometimes it's the distance, sometimes it's the economical situation, sometimes it's the violence in their village or in their region. So this is the priority according to us in Madagascar, and I think it's probably the case in many other countries, strengthening the child protection system to have solutions that are adapted to children that are separated from their family, especially children with albinism.
Wonderful. Thank you for such a comprehensive answer. And thank you also for reminding us that states do have responsibilities to ensure that all these children's rights are protected. And sometimes it feels like these rights are conflicting, and then it's for states to work out solutions in the way you've set out that you're grappling with at the moment in Madagascar. So really good to see that work in process. Thank you. We also had a couple of questions specifically around Madagascar, around the drivers of these attacks towards people with albinism. I'm not going to ask you to go over that again, but I just want to highlight that I've shared the link in the chat to the report of the UN independent experts on her visit to Madagascar, if anyone's interested in that. We've also shared the link to Madam Maluka's report on children with albinism and family life, if you're interested in the broader human rights framework around protecting people with albinism and the right to family life. So they're in the chat. If you have a look, you should be able to see the link to both of those reports, and I'd really recommend you reading those. Thank you, Nicholas. So I'm going to move on now to Perpetua, if that's okay. So Perpetua, we had a couple of questions I thought you would be best placed to answer. The first one's about what, from your perspective in Tanzania, what do you think are the most common causes of family separation? I know this has been a real challenge in Tanzania. So what are the most common causes of family separation for children with albinism? And then the second part of the question is about what are the most effective community-based programs that can be used to try and address those causes from your perspective as someone on the ground in Tanzania seeing that? What are the best programs, interventions, mechanisms to try and prevent children being separated? Over to you.
Thank you, Martin. So the common causes of family separation, the main one is the lingering risk of attacks. It makes people scared. It makes families scared for their children. So parents opt to move their children to other places other than the home setting in order to ensure that their children are safe. That is the main cause. But the other cause is the ongoing discrimination and stigma that comes with the condition of albinism. Some families use it as a loophole, as an excuse that I have a child with albinism, let me just go leave him in a boarding school somewhere, or at that time the shelter somewhere, and he'll no longer be my responsibility. She'll no longer be my responsibility. So those are the two causes mainly that I see. And effective programs that can be used to address these causes. Number one, it is an attitudinal issue. The attacks are an attitudinal issues. The abandonment of children with albinism are an attitudinal issue. So public education is needed. Sensitization of parents, caregivers is highly needed. People need to understand what albinism is, the challenges that come with it, and how to address these challenges. Education among different stakeholders that are working actively to promote the welfare and safety of children with albinism. So if it's the police force, if it's lawyers, if it's judges, caregivers, teachers, they all need to understand how to care for children with albinism, and this is how we're going to keep them with their families. And another thing is accountability. Prosecution of offenders, attackers of children with albinism. People need to see that these offenders are prosecuted. The victims need to see that justice is served. At the end of the day, if these two measures are taken together and people see that things are working, action is being taken, at the end of the day, even the parents are going to feel comfortable that I can live with my child with albinism and they can be safe. Otherwise, this problem is going to be persisting.
Thank you so much, Perpetua. And I'm really glad that you've really emphasized the importance of strengthening justice systems and prosecutions in countries where these attacks are happening, because I think that's an area that those of us working in care reform more generally, it's not something which is a main focus of our work very often. But for this specific issue, it really is important if we're going to stop the attacks and we're going to be able to keep children with families. So that's a great example of how we really need to understand the needs of children with albinism in a way that we don't look at in kind of more everyday, more mainstream care reform. So thank you for that. So I'm going to move on to Peter now. And I've got a question which I think you'll be best placed to answer, which is actually a question from Somalia. And the question is that children with albinism sometimes face severe social isolation within their families. So we're not talking about them being separated. But the question is, how can we create a more inclusive environment for these children within their families and communities? And the reason why I think this is appropriate for you is because in Uganda, children with albinism are largely living in their families, but I wonder if you face this problem there, and I'd love to hear what you've done to tackle that. So isolation within families and in communities. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that question. I think it's very passionate. The way to avoid this is to start from the early stage. First of all, we need the support from both parents to understand that this is our child, and we need to introduce, we shouldn't separate him or have a lot of sympathy on him or treat him so much differently from others. We need, of course, you need to protect, but you shouldn't treat him as a special person always. That will give him a chance or her to play with the colleagues and do even most of the work together. That will embrace. Of course, at the start, they may question why this person different, just like it was at me. But the more they keep interacting, it will erase the other negative attitude. In fact, even they will be protected. They will know, okay, if it's time for playing, it's a lot of sun. We need to play under the shade. Oh, when we're crossing the road, we need to help maybe our fellow. It doesn't sit so well. I think it's one of the way we need to keep them together. By that, it's one of the advantage of not even separating these children, to put them in designated place for them alone. In fact, that increases low self-esteem. But once they are together, it really builds them and they keep even security and protection for this child.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Peter. And that really fits with my understanding of your work that you've talked to me about before, about how in Uganda your strategy has been sort of visibility, making sure that people with albinism are out there in the community. And the more people see people with albinism, the less of an issue that becomes, the less we reduce stigma, the less the less we reduce stigma and the more we reduce discrimination. So that's, yeah, really, really great answer. Thank you very much. So the last question I've got 3 questions now, and they are for you, Maluka, if that's okay. 3 quite slightly different questions. So I'll tell you what, I'll take them one at a time so as to not kind of overwhelm you with too much information. So the first question is about the role of the international community in all of this. The question is, how can the international community better support governments in ensuring the protection and rights of children with albinism, particularly in high-risk regions?
It would help if I unmuted myself. Thank you for the question. I think that's very important to raise this question. I think it's important to build capacity and to learn from other countries, and the international community can facilitate this. So high risk, I think one of the main things that talked about are the attacks, the killings against persons with albinism, the lack of investigation, the lack of prosecution, so lack of accountability basically for those who are being held, who are perpetrators of such attacks. So one way is to build capacity of the criminal justice system, identify the gaps, identify what the barriers are, and then build the capacity for forensic investigations for the police, for example. Build capacity to support the judiciary in ensuring prosecution, legal reform, because we've done, a number of research in different countries has shown that sometimes the laws are not sufficient. Sometimes the police just do not have the capacity to carry out the investigation and get behind whoever is responsible. And sometimes the issue is that justice may be done in a few cases, very few cases, but it's not being seen to be done. So we're not having that the deterrent factor. So if people believe that you can kill someone with albinism and you won't be prosecuted, you won't serve long sentences because the laws are not there, because the police don't know how to investigate, that continues the attacks. So we need to send a clear message that these attacks are not acceptable, and capacity building for the justice sector will help, and the international community can help with that. Funding is always essential as well. What kind of financial support is required for a country in order to prevent attacks, in order to ensure inclusive education, and in order to do the awareness raising. So working with governments to understand what their financial needs are, and the international community can help with that. I mean, there's a whole host of things that we could say, but yeah, just for summary and time's sake, I'd be happy to have further conversations with whoever asked the question to provide more details.
No, that's great. I got for that 3 clear points, which are being a critical friend, like holding countries to accounts, capacity building and funding as well. That's really, really helpful. The second question is about boarding schools, and I'm really glad that someone's asked this question, because I know that it's something that you take very seriously, of getting the nuances of this right, which is around from your findings and your research, in terms of boarding schools which are leaning more towards having an educational purpose, do you think they are equipped to respond to the caring needs of children with albinism and playing a parental role? Is that even possible? It's a difficult one, I know.
It's a difficult point, yeah. So I think with boarding schools, there are nuances, as you say. And the thing is that boarding schools will not always fit within a definition of an institution. And I think we also have to understand what is the reason for a person sending, family sending their children to boarding schools. So if it's for education, legitimately for education, it's not because of the attacks or to relinquish the burden of care. If the child has access to their family, regular access to their family, goes home during holidays, is part of the community. I'm not going to go into the discussion of whether those constitute institutions or not. Those are not the type of boarding schools I'm looking at in my report. I'm looking at boarding schools or situations where children may go to boarding schools and then they never go home. And we have that even in places where there are no attacks. We've had cases, for example, in South Africa, where children will go to boarding schools for first year primary school and never go home, because now the parents just feel they can relinquish the burden. And in that case, because the child has no access to home, to family, that is an institution. And I don't think that boarding school is equipped to look after the child properly in that case. Or if the child is in boarding school because of the attack and then never goes home and doesn't have contact with the family, they're not equipped for that. That's not what boarding schools are set up. They're not set up to be parents, because generally in an education setting, you as a parent still have contact with the school, still have a say in what the school does, in the education, have regular meetings with the boarding school. But where that doesn't happen, it's no longer a boarding school. It now becomes, an institution.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Maluka. I had one more question about stigma, but that's a big issue. So in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there and hand back to Nicola. But I know we were going to give you a minute at the end in case you had any final thoughts. So you might want to share something then. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Martin. Really appreciate it. And thank you so much to all. Rova, I see your hand up. Maybe could you list your question in the text box, just because we literally have only 2 minutes left. And I think the discussion really in many ways has just begun. And I really want to thank Madame Maluka, Yeti, Perpetua, Nicola, Peter, and Martin. It was really important to have, all these key perspectives, starting with that really fantastic overview that Madame Maluka shared at the beginning, and then the really concrete experiences that were shared. And as Martin was saying, a question to you, Maluka, would you like to share any final reflections? And I know, Martin, you had a question in particular on discrimination. So back to you, Maluka, if there's anything you would like to share, any final reflections.
Thank you so much. I think just to share that this is very cross-cutting, multidisciplinary, and there are lots of different issues around that. So the Right to Family Life report is just one of the reports that are relevant. There's a report on protection of persons with albinism, which is relevant, on the access to justice for attacks, several other reports. So I've just shared in the chat a link to all the thematic reports that have been done by myself and my predecessor. And I think that would be a good starting point. It's not always easy for people to see where they are. I'll also share a link to the videos, which just basically summarize some of the issues. And as I've said, I'm always available for discussions, further discussions around these issues. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we'll make sure to also follow up with a message where we will share all the resources and especially also the recording of today, and really look forward to the next steps. And yeah, some of the key takeaways that I really heard across board was this emphasis on the long-term societal behavior change, the need for public education really at all levels, and the importance of visibility to reduce stigma and discrimination. There was a key message coming across on really strengthening child protection systems so that there are solutions for vulnerable groups, such as children with albinism, and strengthening family-based alternative care options. And linked to that, of course, strengthening the backbone of the child protection system, so the social service workforce. There was a key component in the discussion on justice for children with albinism, so it's really strengthening the justice system, ensuring that there's accountability of offenders, and really building the capacity of the justice system. And I think throughout we noticed how important it is that we learn from one another, and that's where we hope also going forward the regional learning platform can make a contribution, starting with the discussion today. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are next year entering the 5th phase of the regional learning platform, where we will continue to produce a number of learning products. We'll have an inception phase where it would be really interesting to hear from you, or you can also already share it now in the chat box, key areas where you think that it would be most helpful to have guidance or case studies. We are planning to have a community of practice on care reform, which will also meet in person, and it would be very interesting to explore how we can integrate today's topic into that community of practice. So we really look forward to discussing this further with you. We're just 1 minute over time, so to mention that we have a survey through which we would like to capture your feedback on today's webinar, and it should be also in the chat box. If not, then we will share it in follow-up. As mentioned, we will in follow-up share the recording and all of the resources that were mentioned today. So I don't see the survey, but maybe I'm missing it. Bertha or Martin, I'm maybe just missing it, am I? I'm seeing the link for the suggestions for the learning platform for the next phase, but I think I don't see the survey. So if I don't hear otherwise, then I would like to thank really all of the panelists, the participants, for your participation today. We really appreciated this opportunity to exchange and look forward to the next steps also as part of the next phase of the learning platform. And thank you very much for your time today. Thank you, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good. Template. Work.